What is going on? We are live. The Detroit Pistons are officially on the wrong side of history. They just hosted the Brooklyn Nets and lost 27th straight loss. Cade Cunningham came out and scored 41 points, and 35, I believe, of those were in the second half. We're going to talk about all of that and more. Going to talk about what got the Pistons in this situation, how we got here as a whole, what they do to get themselves out of the mess that they're in, and overall just the state of the Pistons as a whole. Because listen, as someone who has followed the franchises, for a long time, has covered the franchise now for a couple of years, and especially someone who understands, like what it's like to watch a young team, you expect some peaks and valleys. But for this team with the amount of talent that they have to set the NBA record for most consecutive losses is just something that's really hard for me to wrap my head around. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that feels that way. So, I think this is a fair platform and a time to talk about it. And, obviously with how difficult this season has been, I've been very hesitant to do live content just because, I don't want this to be a ranting session. I don't want this to be a pointing fingers session and saying this person's job needs to be on the line. That's just not who I am. I just don't feel comfortable doing that. But what I do feel comfortable talking about is the basketball side of things, because the basketball often speaks for itself. The numbers don't lie, the eye test doesn't lie, and it's abundantly clear to anybody that watches this team is that this roster needs change, and it needs change badly in some form. And at this point, it doesn't even have to be something that's massive. It can just be something that that is to our rotation, something that just some bench players. It's funny. There was a moment I was watching the game, and James Wiseman came in the third quarter to replace Jalen Duren. By the way, no Marvin Bagley tonight. He was not on the injury report. Part of you wonders if he was dealing with the back issues, but then there was also times where you saw him on the bench, clearly visibly jumping up and down, celebrating with his teammates. So part of you questions if he could have been in the lineup as well. But ultimately, for a team that has as many bigs as the Pistons do, we need more reliable bigs who can play on the court on a consistent basis, because when James Wiseman comes on the court defensively, it just doesn't cut it. He obviously has, moments and flashes where, you go, "Oh, that's why that guy was the number 2 overall pick." But nights like tonight, I mean, 0 points, 0 blocks, 2 rebounds in 12 minutes, 0 of 2 from the field, -12 in the box score. You know, it's just abundantly clear that it's gonna be very hard for him to make up for all of that lost time throughout, his college ranks, throughout his rookie season, with the Warriors, in his time there over the last couple of years. It's just going to be hard for James Wiseman to overcome that. And, the Pistons, it's hard to overcome when they have their bench on the court, because yet again, they have a situation where their starting unit comes out, plays really well. You get a combined 63 points from Cade and Bogdanovich, 75 if you include Jalen Duren. But then you bring in your bench, and sure, Alec Burks gets you 15 points, but it took him 11 shots. The rest of the bench that combines for a total of 20 points. 20 points from your second unit as a whole. Meanwhile, if you want to know why ultimately, the Pistons fell short, Brooklyn was able to pull out and get this win, it's because they had a team-wide overall, display. They had multiple guys getting double figures, 24 points for Cam Johnson, 21 points for Mikal Bridges, 17 points for Cam Thomas, 11 points for Nick Claxton. They had Sharp come off the bench and give 11 points and 11 boards, play really good minutes for them. A guy who I think would fit really well in this Pistons roster, Dorian Finney-Smith, hit the dagger 3 at the end of the game in the corner that, set the Pistons down by 5, and was ultimately the realization that they were indeed going to lose their 27th in a row. Now, this is despite Cade Cunningham having 35 points in the second half, you know, getting 41 points, 9 rebounds, 5 assists, really clutch block towards the end of the game, really good steal as well. I mean, he was everywhere around the court. He didn't sit for a single second outside of timeouts in the second half. He played as well as he possibly can. And I mean, the Pistons are in this peculiar spot where Cade is playing every bit and more the way you would hope he would be playing, especially over the last few games. Cade Cunningham has looked like a transcendent talent. He's looked like the all-star caliber player that we all thought that he could be. The problem is just whenever he's not on the court, this team cannot afford him to sit for a single second. And that is because the current construction of the roster and just the way that it is right now, they can't afford for him to sit for very long. He is the engine that makes this team run. And look, obviously, we saw that this team struggled when Cade Cunningham was out, for the vast majority of last season. 70, I believe it was 70 of the 82 games of last season. But even then, to say that, in hindsight, to look at this roster going into this season and outside of, a couple acquisitions and the likes of a Joe Harris and a guy like a Monte Morris, it's abundantly clear that that wasn't going to be enough to ultimately turn the fortunes of this roster. Now, you bring in a guy like Monty Williams, you make him at the time the highest paid coach in the history of the league. You bring him in to bring a different, culture and to look at that type of development that you're looking for out of this team. But in a lot of ways, it is, if anything, it is regressing. And I mean, you have Monty after the game straight up saying, this is something that, like records are ultimately held to coaches. This is something that are going to be associated with coaches. And, it's one of those things where, it's totally understandable that he takes the blame, but it's hard to blame someone that doesn't quite have all the tools that he needs to be in a successful position. It's hard to blame someone that seemingly has a broken roster, a collective group of players that, even though for all intents and purposes, there's no reports of friction in the locker room. There's no, any sensible disagreements or any true beef within the locker room. Like there's no true disconnection within the team, but they're just so lacking of confidence at this point because of the trials that they've been through, because of the difficulties that they've faced this season. And you get to a point where, just like how teams in, really good teams find a way to win games, young teams, bad teams find a way to lose games. And for the Pistons, unfortunately, a lot of the times that they lose games, especially when it gets to the point where you're in a streak where it's, 27 games long, it's almost to a point where that the way that they find the way to lose is almost like a pattern each and every single night, but it almost rotates in different ways. Right. And, for a team that has so much talent to be in the likes of the Philadelphia 76ers when they started the process, when they had the likes of Ish Smith, a very young Jeremy Grant, who is not near the player that he is today, a young Christian Wood, and then along the teams, along the likes of a Cleveland Cavaliers roster that just lost LeBron James to South Beach. For the Detroit Pistons, who year 4 of this rebuild with the number 1 pick franchise player Cade Cunningham playing as well as he is with as much talent around him, you can't help but be puzzled and ask, how did we get here? What happened? And, Pistons fans are rightfully frustrated, and you can't help but disagree and not, or you can't help but, agree and fathom or, empathize with those players, because it's one of those things that it really just is hard for a fan to tune in on a night-to-night basis. I mean, when something like sports is your escapism and it's something that, you wanna look forward to on a night-to-night basis and you see your team lose 27 times in a row, I believe since the trade deadline, it's only 4 wins. When you're going through a rebuild, and especially, it's understandable when you're going for a guy like a Victor Wembanyama that you wanna lose games, that you wanna position yourselves, to potentially hit big in the lottery, and it's absolutely understandable, but James Edwards III said this in an article earlier this season, and I think it's, I think it says it really well. When you let losing in the building, it's really hard to get it out. And the Pistons for all these years, they didn't want to commit to, building through the draft. They didn't want to commit to doing the full tear down. And, Tom Gores wasn't a believer in tanking. And, you can definitely understand why, because it is a scary process. And I think you're just watching Detroit living out the worst case scenario of what a rebuild can look like in real time. And not to say that it's a worst case scenario in the fact of the talent that they have, because they still have multiple players that you can build something around. They still have guys that I firmly believe they can actually see tangible success with going forward. But at a certain point, when they continue to see these struggles, it almost has to become a concern of, is this going to cause too much permanent damage? Is this something that is going to weigh on the roster too much as the season goes on? And look, obviously, the December 15th date was a key one because that is the unofficial beginning of the trade season. It's difficult for teams to make trades in December. A lot of times teams are more hesitant to make moves, especially teams in the middle of the pack, until around, after the new year and when the deadline comes along, because at that team, you have a little bit of, you have at that time, you have a better idea of where your team's at, what you can do as the season goes on. It's understandable. But I mean, the bottom line is, for this to turn around and for Detroit to actually start chaining together some wins, they need to really start getting some change in that locker room. They really need to bring in some different perspectives, some different players, some people who can help them actually win some games. And, Tom Gores, I feel for him in the sense that it's got to be really hard to invest as much as he has, because if you look at what you want from an owner, he has done a lot of what you want an owner to do, in the sense of he's been willing to spend money. The problem is we've spent the money on the wrong players. He's been willing for the team to go make big trades. The problem is we went and traded for the wrong players. He's been willing to listen and to transition to the rebuild, and he's brought in, basketball people to make basketball decisions. He went and got a highly touted coach and paid the money to do so. He has been very vocal that if there is a reason to pay in the luxury tax, he will do so. But nonetheless, through 12 years of the ownership, it has been a really difficult tenure. And you cannot blame fans for, chanting, sell the team. And listen, I know it's really hard for players to hear. It's really hard for, for people in the organization to hear. It's hard for me to hear. It's hard for anyone to listen in to see a fan base get get to that place. But ultimately, there's only one thing that can cure all of this, and it is winning. And at a certain point, it just becomes, you can say the same things over and over again about where this team is at and some of the encouraging performances from the young players. Jalen Duren coming back and playing as well as he did, especially with missing time, especially with some of the stamina issues that he was dealing with. You really are truly, like, you look at those things and it's like, yeah, I see why I believed in this team in the first place. But in the same light, it's when those guys get, come off the court, and you have to turn to the likes of guys like James Wiseman and Alec Burks, which, by the way, Alec Burks and Isaiah Livers might be two of the most puzzling situations to me on this team this season because of how consistent they've been throughout their careers, albeit Isaiah Livers more so throughout his collegiate career, had some stretches of decent play in the NBA, but ultimately hasn't been able to chain together consistent time on the court due to health. But even just when he has had some time this season, he's only averaged in the last few games about 19% from the field. That's not from three, that's from the field. And when you have a player who's a career 40% three-point shooter that's in that state, a guy like Alec Burks, who before this injury that he had to his arm earlier this season, for the last year and a half, he has been one of the most steady, consistent players on this team, especially on the offensive side of the ball, especially shooting it from beyond the arc. But for whatever reason, when you get to this type of losing, when you get to this level of continual pressure, this level of mental anguish that you go through as a basketball player, losing that many games in a row, it's going to have an effect on you. And I just think that you're just seeing that across the board. I mean, another unfortunate thing that, that's been really difficult as well, a guy like Marcus Sasser, who at times has really shown why he was seen as so valuable in the middle of that first round, this last year in the draft. Tonight, in 10 minutes, essentially for all intents and purposes, got some cardio in. I mean, he had 0 points. He was 0-1 from the field, didn't get any assists, didn't really contribute anywhere on the court. And, when you don't really have that spark plug that you can bring off the bench, or you don't have those guys that you can lean on to really take the car and keep it on the road while dad naps for a little bit. I mean, you can't drive 24/7, expect dad to keep his eyes open and not expect the car to swerve off the road at some point. And ultimately, that's just where this team is at right now. I mean, it's just Cade is phenomenal. He's looking every bit the part that you would want your number one overall franchise player to look. He's had multiple 40-point games over the last couple games. He has played in major stretches, and he has played some really good basketball, but ultimately it's caused him to, like work his ass off and ultimately, work on a lot of parts in his game. But at the same light, even Greg Kelser said it during Pistons Live tonight. You at a certain point, you worry that this is something that can affect a player mentally, that this is something that can cause them to deject mentally. And, clearly Cade sees that because he talked about how he told the team that they need to stay together mentally. Clearly it's on his mind, that how it's easy to be dejected. And frankly, I'm sure part of him has to be telling himself that right now. And the tricky thing is, what does this team do on the trade market? Because they haven't really been able to acquire assets since Troy Weaver has taken over. They didn't have much to really build off of and really acquire and accumulate assets. And now, realistically, if they want to make a major move, like to this commenter's point, you would have to part with a pretty significant piece. Bojan Bogdanovic obviously is a guy that, is ever since he was brought into the team, and especially when he was extended, it was pretty apparent that at some point, more than likely, he's probably going to be moved before that contract expires, just because the way that it was set up is that it was a team-friendly contract. It was something that is easy to trade. It's salary that's easy to maneuver in a transaction. But, when you're in a position where in order to, turn the ship around, you have to potentially risk trading one or multiple players that you really believe in, and players that, you don't want to see come back and bite you. I mean, doesn't that kind of sound like where the Pistons were before? I mean, I know people talk about, how they miss the Brandon Jennings days, and I absolutely feel people on that. But, when the Pistons traded for Brandon Jennings, people forget who they traded in order to get him. They traded Chris Middleton. and he is now one of the best Bucks players in franchise history, helped them bring a championship alongside Giannis Antetokounmpo. How many different players Spencer Dinwiddie tonight was another guy that we saw, ultimately thrive when he left Detroit. Bruce Brown is another guy that was really difficult to see go and become the player that he has been. It's history has a real tendency to repeat itself if you're not careful. And that's the really tricky situation that the Pistons find themselves, especially as they go down the stretch of this season is, you clearly need to make some form of move. You clearly are in a situation where the franchise needs some form of shift and it needs it quickly. But on the other hand, if you make the wrong move, you could potentially fracture this even deeper. And so do I envy, being Troy Weaver or Tom Gores right now, or Arn Tellem, or anyone, within that front office who has to make significant decisions or difficult, have those difficult conversations? Absolutely not. I do not envy it even a little bit. But on the other hand, it's not like they are not aware of the task at hand and what is in front of them. The question really is how much longer until they actually pull the trigger on a move? How much longer do they let this roster continue to go out there and continue to struggle? Because if it doesn't get better soon, you have to question just how much more damage it can do to players in the locker room. It makes you question, what's happening, internally with the coaching staff. And ultimately, it's one of those things where, this is the Murphy's Law of basketball, right? Anything this season that could have gone wrong has gone wrong. And, again, I know that it's a situation where you want to point fingers and you want to go, well, who deserves the blame the most? It goes from the top down, and, every single person that is involved in the basketball sense of it does deserve some form of blame. But ultimately, Tom Gore said that, this falls on him and Troy. And I have to agree with that because they have talked about the importance of setting themselves up with the salary cap to have the flexibility to be able to actually move forward and actually piece something together. But on the other hand, the flexibility that only does you so much until you actually use it, until you maximize it with the right players, until you're able to make that a tool that can actually aid Cade Cunningham, that can actually aid guys like Jaden Ivey, Jalen Duren, Asar Thompson, whoever you decide ultimately to build around. Because even though there are a lot of players to ultimately like on this team, there are a lot of reasons to still believe, in some of the players in this locker room, and a good amount of the players in this locker room. Once you reach this historic level of losing, once you're associated with some of the worst teams in the history of the sport, at that point, change has to happen in some fashion. And the biggest cynics, of the Pistons, I don't think could have predicted a season to go like this. And ultimately, I think if anything like tonight's game shows you anything at all, it's just how much the city of Detroit deserves a winner as a whole. How much they deserve a winner on the basketball court, because they showed out yet again to try and help this team, avoid being on the wrong side of history. They, for a team that is having one of the worst seasons, in the history of their franchise, in the history of the sport, they're still 15th in attendance. They're still showing out to root this team on. They still, are passionate and are invested in the direction of this team and where they're heading. And that needs to be honored. And that needs to be honored with wins on the court. And it's one of those things where, you know, obviously you want to see, you want to see success and you want to see it now. And you get and you want to see all of these years of struggle finally pay off and start to head in the right direction. And it really seemed like that's what this season was supposed to be. And there's still a vast majority of the season left. There is more basketball to be played than there has been played. But in the same light, unless there are some critical changes made of some form, then this is doomed to continue to head in a pretty rough direction, as this season goes on. And yes, they'll have salary cap space, to address some needs and to really plug some holes, but your options are getting pretty limited as far as, some of the solutions. Now, obviously, we know some of the reported players of who they would potentially be interested in. OG Anunoby is a player that, obviously, a profile that fits the bill of what this team needs. A versatile defensive wing, someone who can hit threes, someone who is really competitive on both sides of the court. I know that I know that they're interested in guys like Tobias Harris, who can stretch the floor, who can bring leadership, who's a veteran, who's been in Detroit before, who can score the basketball on a consistent basis. I've personally heard of some names that have not been reported that I don't feel necessarily I'm able to talk about, but would definitely make some noise and would make a splash. But ultimately, I just think that it doesn't even have to be a big name at this point. It could even be a Alex Caruso. It could even be a TJ McConnell. It can be some form of bench player that brings a different level of energy, that brings a different perspective. At this point, it just needs to be somebody. It needs to be sometime. It needs to be something. Broder, I appreciate you, my guy. I want to give him props as well, real quick, too, just for the coverage he's done this year. I do want to take a quick minute. I know just to give myself a break to talk about something positive. The Lions, for the first time in my lifetime, are going to host a playoff game, won the division. Thank the Lord. I think that's what's getting us through all of this right now. Imagine if the Lions weren't playing well on top of all this. I think we'd be falling apart. But ultimately, the really tricky thing is, in order to make some form of improvement and in order to make an upgrade, they're going to have to give up players that they really believe in, players that they really like, and players that they were probably not anticipating parting with anytime soon. And you can't help but wonder, especially, with the impending trade and moves that they're going to have to make to, fix this roster. It's one of those things, which, by the way, hey, by the way, I was the one who was about bringing Jalen Brunson into the picture. Everyone was like, "Oh, Sean doesn't know what he's talking about. This Jalen Brunson guy, you can't overpay him." He'd look pretty good in a Pistons uniform right about now. You telling me otherwise? Come on now. Him and Cade Cunningham in the backcourt, that would have been absolute magic. It would have been fireworks. But I digress. Nonetheless, I still and that's the other thing. Jane and Ivy has been playing really well too. And that's the frustrating thing, is you can't recognize these performances. You can't point out and go, "Hey, look at this development." When in the same light, it's like, "Oh, but they just lost yet another game." Right? Like you can't there's only so much you can actually look at those types of performances and actually, you know, pull out and actually look at some things. The thing that's striking to me, though, is, and honestly, this is really just to transition and to spend the last little bit of this pod talking a little bit about the rest of the league, because honestly, I'm a level with y'all. I don't know what else more to say in this current moment. I mean, the Pistons have found themselves in a really tricky spot. I am going to be bringing in some, some beat writers, some other people, around the community to discuss and to deep dive and to, talk all things Pistons and the trade market and what potential moves can be made because, ultimately the biggest thing in the Pistons, the biggest story facing the Pistons right now is how do they dig themselves out of this hole? How do they turn this situation around with some of the gems that they have in house? How do they take the things that they actually have in house and turn it into a winning franchise? Because in my opinion, I think you still have I think you still have what could be the right coach. I think you still have a good talent evaluator as far as drafting is concerned in the front office. I think you still have a guy that, at the very least, if you put him alongside another star can be a threat. It's very clear that there are pieces and things to put this together. But ultimately, the biggest story is until they actually make moves and actually make changes, it's impossible to feel like they're not just going to keep, moving down this path. And so, again, you just hope that this doesn't hurt prospects, especially guys like Asar Thompson, who, coming into the league, playing as well as as well as he is, and the fire that he has on the defensive side of the ball. To see, guys like him have to go through, tribulations like this, especially in his first season, absolutely rough. But honestly, again, I don't know what else there is to say other than, the city of Detroit deserves better. The players, within the locker room deserve better. And, ultimately, all you can ask is that the team, actively as the season goes on, looks for ways to put themselves in a better position because obviously this season's a lost cause as far as play-in hopes, as far as playoff hopes. I haven't looked at how far back they are in a while, but as of right now, as far as games back from the play-in tournament, they're about 11 games back from the 10th spot at this time. And not to even talk about that even being a possibility because we all know it's not at this point. But I mean, that's kind of the point, right? Is, you know, change needs to happen. And yeah, that's really all I can say about it. And the thing that's amazing is for them being the team that is looking as bad as they are and is struggling as much as they are, they somehow don't have as bad of body language as the Phoenix Suns, who, don't get me wrong, they're on their own struggles of their own. They're on their own different level of pressure. Another local Detroit guy, Matt Ishbia, coming in, buying the team literally on his first day, pushing all of his chips in the middle of the table, trading for Kevin Durant, going and getting Bradley Beal in the offseason and saying the new collective bargaining agreement, we're getting the big three in Phoenix. And the result thus far is I think they've played like 20 minutes thus far, the three of them together this season. And you already have on Christmas Day, Woj having to come out and talk about how the Suns are very aware that Kevin Durant is frustrated. You have the hot mic picking up Devin Booker going, no one's going to come back. Not, you're going to turn the ball over and not get back. Like, man, the situation in Phoenix is absolutely puzzling because, again, you just 2 years ago, you were in the finals. You had a roster full of young, versatile wings and players that fit perfectly alongside Devin Booker. You had a number one overall pick in the interior who, yes, is not Luka Doncic and is very much hurting you each and every day with the reminder that he is not Luka Doncic, but damn it, at least he's better than Yusuf Nurkic and whatever the hell else is on this roster. And I mean, when you bring in this much star heavy talent at the top of your roster, you're not going to have much of a chance to fill it out with much else. And this is what happens when the best of your when the best of your role players is the likes of Eric Gordon, guys like Grayson Allen, guys like Keita Bates-Diop, Yuta Watanabe. Like this is a team that is lacking in talent as a whole, and they don't really have the cap space. They don't have the assets. They don't have anything to make this better. The only assets they have are the players that they're not going to want to trade if they actually want to make this thing work. And the thing is that with especially Kevin Durant being as old as he is, with Bradley Beal struggling with health as much as he is, not knowing how much more he actually has to be the player that we thought he could be. It's just one of those things that just makes you go, man, what are the Phoenix Suns doing? How do they get themselves out of this hole? How do they actually fix this? Because I mean, you look realistically in the Western Conference right now. I mean, they're right now the Suns are last in their division, by the way. And as of right now, if the playoffs were to start today, the Phoenix Suns would not even be in the play-in tournament. I mean, you go top to bottom in the standings. Are they better than the Timberwolves? No. Are they better than the Nuggets? No. Are they better than the Thunder right now? No. Kings? No. Mavericks? No. Clippers? No. Then you get to like the Pelicans, and that's where you could actually start having some debate. But even then, that's a red flag. If you're talking about a team with Kevin Durant scoring over 30 plus points a game, guys like Devin Booker, who's been averaging 27 points a game and looking as awesome as he has, and being as good of a facilitator as he can be, and you're still losing this many games, and the vibes are still this off this early, and you just can't help but feel like Kevin Durant's looking at this situation and going, did I just get myself in Brooklyn, but the desert? Did I just get myself in a worse situation than I was in? And I have no idea how this is going to end. I have no idea, how, like what is actually going to happen. I know it's worse being in a situation where your team loses 27 straight games and you don't know where the light is at the end of the tunnel. But man, does it have to be frustrating when you know that you have some of the best basketball players in the world, that you know that you have players that can get you to the finals, that you know that there's no reason that you shouldn't be better than you are, yet you are somehow this bad. The Phoenix Suns are 3-8 in their last 11, absolutely puzzling stuff. Overall, I mean, Luka Doncic just absolutely had his way with them on Christmas Day, absolutely showed why he's one of the best players in the world. 50 points, the maestro that he is. I mean, 50 points and 15 assists. The Phoenix Suns have no resistance on the defensive side of the ball. And, yes, they have guys, that can play. They have some of the best players to ever play the sport, but being top heavy is only going to get you so far. But ladies and gentlemen, I think that's about as much basketball as I'm going to be able to talk tonight. I know that this was a little bit of a short podcast, but I figured, especially under the circumstances, the way that game went, I figured these circumstances needed to be talked about live. And so with that, folks, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in, but also I want to thank you guys for continuing to support the podcast. This is, obviously not been a season, been an easy season as a fan, for anybody, but obviously as someone, that covers the team, that wants to see them succeed. Obviously, it's not easy to talk about them in these types of situations either, but nonetheless, it's what I love to do. It's what I get to do here on this channel. And I really appreciate all your support. If you like the podcast, be sure you like the video down below, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content, hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything and any uploads. Also, be sure you follow me on X, Twitter. You can find whatever I want to call it at Sean Halfcourt. You can find other content on there as well. Again, thanks so much for tuning in. We will be getting more content with the new year coming around, not just Pistons, all things NBA, because I just love talking the sport. But with that, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll catch you guys next time from Half Court. Be sure you're subscribed.